The command post was a scene of controlled chaos, a low hum of desperation beneath the barked orders. Dust, stirred by a recent mortar impact, hung in the slanted beams of late afternoon sun. Colonel Eris Thorne, his uniform stained with sweat and earth, stood over a map laid on a rickety table, his knuckles white where they pressed into the wood. The news was catastrophic. A forward reconnaissance unit, led by Major Lena Vance, had been ambushed and encircled in the rocky foothills of the Grey Crags. Intercepted comms crackled with grim finality. Enemy forces were moving her and two surviving sergeants to a high-security compound. Extraction by air or ground assault was suicide. The terrain was a natural kill box. "We have a 6-hour window, maybe less," Thorne growled, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "That compound is a fortress. One road in, sheer cliffs on 3 sides. They'll break her or parade her on camera. We cannot let that happen." His eyes, hard and flinty, swept the room, a collection of his best officers and senior non-commissioned officers. "We need a precision solution. A single perfect shot to break the lock." He slammed a fist down, making the map tremble. "Any sharpshooters?" he roared, the question less an inquiry and more a challenge to the fates. A tense silence followed. They had marksmen, good ones, but the projected distance based on the drone's shaky footage was beyond anything in their manuals. The wind in the crags was a notorious, unpredictable beast. It was a shot whispered about in legends, not in standard operating procedures. Just as a young captain began to speak of high-risk helicopter insertion, a figure shifted in the shadowed corner by the radio equipment. The movement was slight, but it drew every eye. He was an older man, his hair more salt than pepper, his face a landscape of fine lines carved by sun and silence. His name was Cale. He wore the insignia of a sergeant, but it seemed an afterthought on his weathered uniform. He did not speak. He simply took 3 deliberate steps forward, the worn soles of his boots making no sound on the packed earth. He stopped before the colonel's table, his posture not of rigid attention, but of a quiet, absolute readiness. He didn't offer a salute or a boast. He just looked at Thorne, then at the topographic map, his pale blue eyes calculating, absorbing. The room held its breath. This was the man others spoke of in low tones around campfires, the ghost who returned from missions with untouched rations and a 1,000-yard stare. The silent legend had stepped forward. Thorne studied him for a long moment, the unasked questions hanging between them. Finally, the colonel simply pointed to the map coordinates. "The compound watchtower. They'll bring her through the courtyard at dawn for transfer. It's the only chance. Can you make the shot?" Cale's gaze was already tracing an invisible path across the map's contours. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a promise, but an acknowledgement of a task that had become his. He turned and left the command post, the silence parting for him and closing behind him like water. The journey into the Grey Crags was a solitary pilgrimage. Cale moved like a shadow, a ghillie suit of torn burlap, and local foliage turning him into a piece of the landscape. He carried his rifle, an old but impeccably maintained weapon, not as a soldier carries a tool, but as a craftsman carries a cherished instrument. His world narrowed to the scent of crushed juniper, the feel of granite under his fingertips, the subtle shift of the air. He climbed through the night, a silent ascension up the treacherous back slopes opposite the compound, a route deemed impassable by the enemy and, until now, by his own command. Memories, usually kept in a locked room of his mind, seeped out in the rhythm of his climb. He saw not the rock before him, but the face of a young soldier, his own spotter, in a different war under a different sun. A flash of light on a distant dune, a fraction of a second too late. The memory ended with a deafening silence that had never really left his ears. That was the day the talkative young man named Cale had died, and the silent sniper had been born. He climbed not for glory, nor for the army, but for the simple, devastating equation he had lived by since. One life, taken with utmost care to save another. It was a penance, and a purpose. As false dawn bled into the sky, he found his nest, a crack in a massive granite outcrop, overlooking the valley like the eye of a god. It was perfect and terrible. The compound courtyard was a small, concrete square over 2 kilometers away. The distance was a yawning chasm. He settled into the earth, becoming stone himself. From a worn pouch, he took a small, smooth river stone and placed it on the rock before him, a ritual, a totem for the wind. He then began the silent liturgy of his craft. He measured the cold, thin air, calculated the drop, and watched his stone. Tiny grains of dust, lifted by the nascent breeze, danced around it, telling him secrets no anemometer could. The shot was at the very edge of possibility, a thread he would have to sew through a hurricane. He loaded a single, hand-loaded round, his fingers steady and deliberate. In the courtyard below, as the sun's first ray touched the highest tower, a metal door clanged open. His world dissolved until it contained only the crosshair, the wind, and the distant figure being shoved into the light. The morning was cold, the light a pale, merciless gray. In the compound courtyard, Major Lena Vance stood, back straight, facing her captors. Her face was bruised, but her eyes were fierce, refusing to show the fear that coiled in her gut. She knew what a transfer meant. Beyond the gates lay oblivion. A tall officer in a crisp uniform, Captain Varek, stood before her, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he recited charges into a handheld camera. This was the moment Cale, watching through his powerful scope, had waited for. Varek moved behind Vance, his hand on her shoulder, presenting her to the lens. For a second, his head aligned perfectly behind hers, a macabre dance. In his nest, Cale's breathing had slowed to almost nothing. His finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger. The wind, as he predicted, was a demon. It swirled down from the peaks, a transverse gust that would push the bullet a full meter off target at this distance. He waited. He was not a man firing a rifle, but a man asking the universe for a momentary stillness. The river stone seemed to tremble. Vance subtly shifted her weight, a defiant tilt of her chin. Varek, annoyed, stepped half a pace to the side to grab her arm, clearing the line. For less than 2 seconds, the chaotic winds weaving through the valley coalesced into a single, predictable stream. Cale's world went preternaturally quiet. He exhaled, and, in the pause between heartbeats, his finger took up the slack. The report of the rifle was a flat, swallowed crack, lost instantly in the vastness of the mountains. In the courtyard, Captain Varek's head jerked as if struck by an invisible hammer. A fine, red mist painted the air beside Major Vance's cheek. He crumpled without a sound. For a split second, utter confusion reigned. The guard stared, unable to process the sudden, violent death from an empty sky. Vance, her military mind cutting through the shock, didn't hesitate. She dropped to the ground, rolling towards the cover of a nearby fuel drum as shouts erupted and automatic weapons fire began to rip aimlessly into the distant cliffs. Cale was already moving. The shot was made, but his mission was not over. He had just announced his location with a signature that a competent enemy tracker could trace. He ejected the spent brass, pocketing it automatically, and melted back from the outcrop. Down below, chaos was his ally. As enemy squads scrambled, a prearranged diversion struck the compound's front gate, a concentrated mortar barrage from Thorne's men, the sound of Cale's shot being their signal. While the enemy's attention was split, a small, fast reaction force, guided by the drone, now buzzing overhead, infiltrated the now-neglected rear wall. They found Vance, seizing her moment, had overpowered a distracted guard. She was running toward the breach, the 2 rescued sergeants covering her with stolen weapons. The extraction was violent, swift, and successful. As their vehicles sped away, the only response from the compound was disorganized, furious fire aimed at ghosts. A week later, the base had a different air. The frantic energy had subsided into a weary routine. Major Vance had been debriefed, treated, and was already back at work, a new steel in her gaze. The official report cited a precision long-range engagement, enabling a successful rescue. No names were mentioned. In a quiet corner of the mess hall, Colonel Thorne sat across from Cale. The old sergeant was stirring his coffee, his eyes distant, seeing not the room but perhaps that distant courtyard or a different desert altogether. "They're giving her a medal," Thorne said quietly. "She insisted you should be the one getting it. Wants to thank you herself." Cale looked up, a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No need," he said, his voice a low rustle, and used. "She saved herself. She was ready. I just turned the key." Thorne understood. The shot was a miracle, but the Major's quick thinking had turned miracle into reality. "What about the wind, Cale?" The team calculated it. It was impossible. A long silence stretched between them. Cale's hand went to his pocket, fingering the smooth, cool surface of the river stone within. "The wind tells you a story," he finally murmured. "Most people try to shout over it. I just listened for the pause between the words." He offered no more explanation. Later that evening, as the sun set, Cale walked to the perimeter fence, looking out towards the now distant gray crags. He felt the familiar hollow quiet settle inside him, the quiet that always followed the thunder. The memory of his old spotter's face came again, but this time it was followed by the image of Major Vance, alive, breathing the free air. The equation, for once, felt balanced. He was not a hero in any story anyone would tell. He was a man who carried a rifle and a stone, a man who listened to the wind so others could live to feel it on their faces. He turned his back on the darkening mountains and walked towards the barracks, just another silhouette in the fading light, his legend already retreating back into the comforting, necessary silence.